This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. We're joined once again by the marvelous Tony Parkinson, who's joining us all the way from South Australia. How are you today, Tony?
Good, Jamie. Good. Yeah. Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you. It's been some almost 2 years or thereabouts since we last met in Toronto, shared some Black Chook, some of your other wines as well. How have things
Yeah.
been with Black Chook, with Thomas, is it Thomas Goss? Goss?
Thomas Goss, yes.
Thomas Goss, and Penny Hill. What's been going on in the interim almost 2 year period? Because a lot's been happening in the world since we last spoke.
Well, yes. So we met in Toronto 2019, and things were steaming along happily until the pandemic hit in
Yes.
March pretty much of 2020. And from there, of course, things have changed. So on a local scene, we closed our restaurant mid-March last year. That was a 7-day operation. We closed that as a first reaction to the pandemic. And there were various impositions or restrictions imposed. And I think we, I guess from all points of the compass, we struggled a little bit to work out exactly what was going to happen. Of course, yes. I think that's true of the world. There was an idea that the virus started in China, and I think that's been an interesting impact for Australia because our politicians, our Prime Minister, in fact, challenged this situation with the Chinese, and they have reacted, maybe not entirely on that score, but they have reacted by adding massive tariffs to Australian wine imports. And as a company, we were not particularly dependent on China, but the wash up of that is that there is now a lot of wine that has pivoted from destination China to markets unknown. In other words, there's more wine in the system than really can be taken up. So that's a challenge at the moment. But through that pandemic period, I guess we've done well in South Australia to keep infection and fatalities to a minimum. But the restrictions are telling on morale, on business, on virtually every aspect of life. People are recalibrating, they're rethinking their priorities, etc. We've been very slow in this country to embrace vaccination, so we've now got some momentum with that, but we were very slow, and I think there was confusion about which vaccination option to take.
Right.
And a lot of media-driven and social media-driven opinion, which as I think we know, can work both positively and negatively. But
correct me if I'm wrong here, Tony, but I believe that South Australia is actually doing quite well on the vaccination front now. I think they're saying by December you'll be up to, I think, 2 jabs of 80% of the population or something like that.
Yes, you are well informed. That is about right. It just took a long time to get going.
Right.
But for example, I've had both jabs, so I'm double vaccinated. The question, of course, from here on is, as happened with the Delta strain, what comes next? So we're assuming that the vaccination will not necessarily mean that you are unable to pass the virus on, but the impacts will be should be less if you are vaccinated.
I was reading last night, and again, correct me if I've been misled here, but I believe South Australia has a thing they're calling it's not, perhaps it is Freedom Day on the 23rd of November, where you're actually opening your borders, because you have sort of everything. I mean, you don't have very many cases at all in South Australia. And this
No,
idea, I believe, is to open the borders and have a controlled influx of the virus. Is there any truth in this?
that is correct.
Oh, okay. What are your
That is,
thoughts on this idea?
well, look, I think there's got to be some relaxation of borders, and with appropriate controls in place, fine. But there's a theory that had government mandated vaccination, we'd probably be through that stage already.
Yeah.
So it's been left to the individual, and it's interesting how peer pressure is impacting that decision. And there are people I know who are, intelligent, widely read, whatever, but they're not vaccinating.
Yeah, no, the same over here as well. Some great friends as well.
And the similes have been put that we don't know necessarily what's in some of the fast food that we eat, but we're happy to eat it. Whereas we're concerned in some cases about what might happen if we vaccinate. So I think more and more, yes, we'll reach the 80% target, and we are opening up the borders, but in controlled conditions.
You mentioned those punitive measures, the punitive tariffs from China, but you didn't mention how harsh they were. They're actually quite steep, aren't they?
They're between about 160 and 212%.
Yeah, so that's meant to send a message for sure.
Yeah, and prior to that, over a 4-year period, we had reached a free trade agreement. So duty went progressively down. I think it was something like 19%, progressively reduced to zero. And we only had a couple of years of zero before this impost has occurred. So it's crazy.
So, the last year and a half have been a bit of a whirlwind, but when did you first kind of hear about everything that was going on with this pandemic? Because you do a lot of traveling, right?
Yeah, I've been traveling, say 3 or 4 times overseas for some years, as you know. And what happened early last year was that I was booking itinerary for Canada, US actually, and also had plans to travel to Asia, to New Zealand, etc., Europe. And what happened was the Canadians were putting together an itinerary. So I normally try to go west to east, east to west, and not double back.
Yeah.
There was some doubling back options being put on the table. So at the same time that was happening, in consultation with our travel agent here, I said, "What do you think of the pandemic, and what do you expect?" He said, "Look, it'll blow over. It'll be fine. Just go ahead and book your trips."
Right. Okay.
And he's a travel agent, and I have to say, it's a good friend of mine, and the poor guy has had his business decimated. Predominantly because his main source of income was cruise ships. Anyway, so he was gently pressing me to go ahead with the bookings, and from Canada, from our guys at Delph in Vancouver, it became apparent that there was some threat to my planned itinerary.
Right.
And due to the delays in sorting that out, suddenly the pandemic reared its head, you might say. And so tastings in places like Winnipeg and whatever were being cancelled that early. And I was then able to not proceed with booking that trip. Now, of course, we assumed that might blow over and we'd be moving again, sometime later in the year. Whereas in fact, the only travel I've done, and this is interesting, the only travel I've done out of South Australia was in May this year. So that was 14 months after I'd last travelled. I travelled last Adelaide to Melbourne in March 20. May 21, I've gone to Melbourne for 3 days, primarily to do business and catch up with a few people. And Melbourne had an outbreak. And so I got back into South Australia, but I had to quarantine at home for 14 days.
Right.
So my one and only excursion out of the state resulted in me being isolated, being locked out.
And that was before they closed the borders, right?
Yes, well, there had been closures before, but yes, this is before the last one.
Yes.
And I think what's come out of this, and it's exactly what you and I are doing now, we have embraced Zoom, telephone, and email. And so I have not traveled outside the country now for a year and a half. I've obviously saved some money, but we haven't really suffered downturn in business due to me not being on the scene, and that can be interpreted several ways. But I think it's true that our industry has dramatically reduced its travel, obviously, but business has pretty much maintained. And I guess right now we're feeling the impact of this China tariff situation I've referred to. But you know, it's changed our habits, and a Zoom conference is part of the normal day.
Yeah, and it will become. It is the new normal, right?
Yeah, and I think you actually get, if you have an agenda for a meeting, you actually get more done. Because I've had that experience, as you can imagine, where you arrive in a given market, no matter how prepared you would like them to be, it doesn't happen. So your trade visits are generally, you know, there's some meaningful ones, and there are others that are compromised. What we've refined to, or what we had refined to, is meeting with distributors and sales teams, rather than pounding the beat. Pounding the beat's terrific, but more often than not, there's that massive separation. So a small retailer might meet a wine producer, and it's hail fellow, well met. But then there's the void after the visit, and you know, it takes effort to keep that maintained. And I think the important thing has been informing sales staff in our distributor network, who can then impart the message, and yourself, of course.